welcome to Fellowship Baptist Church. We have the unique experience today to go back and travel in history. So if you are a guest with us, this is something very unique to our ministry here, but very exciting as we all take and participate in time travel a little bit today for both Sunday school as well as in our following church service. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we are grateful that we are able to go back through drama, through theater, and really understand how this country was built and how it was founded upon biblical principle. And Lord, help us to be grateful and thankful for the freedoms that we do have and for the men and women who have chosen to go through trying times in order to not only provide freedoms, but to maintain them. And Lord, we all know that safety is from you. And all the freedoms that we do possess are because of you, your grace and your mercy upon us. And Lord, for that we are grateful. Thank you for allowing us to gather today on this Lord's Day, freely, without persecution, without pressure, where we can understand your word and learn. To that, Lord, we give you great thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. The recent turn of national political events has caused many to have a sense of urgency in this hour. Some have observed that traditional values and biblical principles are in the crosshairs of those who have the intent to destroying the very foundations upon which our great republic was built. In his book, Where the Right Went Wrong, Patrick Buckingham raises a most probing question concerning the future of America. Very simply yet bluntly, he asks, is the old republic gone forever? Buchanan quickly responds with the famous phrase, "Forbid it, Almighty God." Of course, he was quoting Patrick Henry, who uttered this statement in equally dark, if not darker times than this. Just who is this Patrick Henry, who merits the more than 2 centuries after his earthly sojourn ended? Although Patrick Henry only traveled outside his native colony and state 3 times during his entire life, he has made an impact on every person sitting in this room today. A perhaps forgotten American for many generations, Patrick Henry was, in truth, America's first national hero. He was the most powerful political figure in colonial Virginia. He was the first governor of Virginia. He was the oratorical and political leader which ensured the inclusion of the Bill of Rights as part of the United States Constitution. What is even less known about Patrick Henry is his fortuitous meeting and interaction with the Great Awakening preachers. How did these divine junctures shape this man, the trumpet voice of liberty? Today, we can find out as we transport ourselves back in time to the second week of August in the year 1799. Word of Patrick Henry's death has spread rapidly across the countryside, and now you and I find ourselves present at the reading of Patrick Henry's last will and testament. What kinds of emotion are ranging through your mind? Just what is the legacy of Patrick Henry? Here to help us explore these and pertinent aspects of this important, yet perhaps forgotten hero, is Dr. John S. Reese, who has taught history at Pensacola Christian College for the past 37 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reese as he comes to present a historical monodrama entitled The Trumpet Voice of Liberty, The Life and Times of Patrick Henry.
I have now disposed of all of my property to my family. There is one more thing I wish I could give them, and that is the Christian religion. If they had that, and I had not given them 1 shilling, they would have been rich. And if they had not that, and I had given them all of the world, they would be poor. This is all the inheritance I can give to my dear family. The religion of Christ can give them one which will make them rich indeed. Those are the words from Patrick Henry's last will and testament. And they encapsulate the spirit, the life of a man that had a profound influence on his generation, and in fact, on the world to come. In fact, I can still picture the scene. Oh, by the way, I apologize. The name is Caddington, Edward Caddington. I was there in March of 1775, standing right outside the window at the old St. John's Church, as Patrick Henry gave that now famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. I was in Richmond on business. I'd already signed on to the militia, and it was one of those cold, impounding type of days where it felt like the snow was going to come any time. But that didn't keep the people away from the old church there, old St. John's Church. In fact, both sides of the narrow aisle were packed. The alcove to the north was packed. It was so hot and stuffy inside, they opened the windows. Good thing, because I stood right outside the window. I was almost within arm's reach of the man when I heard Patrick Henry give his famous speech. And as he was there, it was almost like a country preacher, long and slender, those dark eyebrows making his blue-gray eyes look almost dark and penetrating. And I listened to that voice, that elocution, and I began to hear. Can you hear too?
It is natural for a man to indulge in the illusion of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against things of truth and listen to the song of the siren until she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a long and arduous struggle for liberty? They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be in the next week? Or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength through irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs, hugging the delusive phantom until our enemies have bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak while we make proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people, armed, and in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that we possess, are invincible by any force our enemy can send against us. Besides, sirs, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sirs, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, we have no election. Should we be base enough to desire it, it is already too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. That plenty may be heard upon the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sirs, let it come. The gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the the north shall bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased? At the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for thee, give me liberty, or give me death.
The audience sat in stunned silence for several moments. I stood outside the door and breathed out the words, "Let me be buried at this very spot." Now, few individuals in history have had the power of personality and the ability of persuasion of such that they can literally change the direction of history. Fewer still have the character and the valor to use those powers to change society for the better. Patrick Henry was such a man. In fact, his story, the makings of that goes all the way back to his childhood days. Patrick Henry was actually the son of a second Virginia. Now, you're in the general area, so you know the geography. I don't need to give us a lesson. By the way, it's good to be back in this area. It's been a while since I was here, and things have changed quite a bit, I will say, since I was last traversing these areas. But you know well how that the Tidewater region there of Virginia was established by well-known names. The Fitzhugh family, the Byrd family, the Lees, the Washingtons, and all. But there arose a second Virginia from the Tidewater region out to Richmond would be the first area. And then beyond the waterfalls, out toward the mountains, lay a second Virginia. And that's where Patrick Henry was born, in Hanover County on May 29, 1736. Hanover County. It was named after the recent king that took over in England, the Hanoverian line. And Patrick Henry's parents were of very interesting descentage. His dad was a Scotsman who had come over 13 years prior, who's a surveyor by training, had attended King's College in Scotland, so was well versed. He went to work as a surveyor for a gentleman in Hanover County, not knowing that that gentleman's wife would become his wife whenever the employer passed. So John Henry, the father of Patrick, was a surveyor, and he went to work for this gentleman. He did end up marrying this lady. They called her Sally Winston. Sarah was her official name. And the Winston family was very involved in religious activities. Her dad, Isaac, was of the Presbyterian persuasion. And of course, I don't need to remind you, but you probably recall that Virginia had rather strict rules about attending the Anglican Church. And more than once, Isaac Winston stood before his own son-in-law, that would be John Henry, and had to pay fines. John was serving also as a magistrate. In addition to being a surveyor, he became a judge. And so father-in-law had to come into the courtroom and pay fines for not attending the Anglican Church. How about that? So that was John Henry, the father of. And then I mentioned Sarah by name. She really took to the religious awakening. She responded very favorably to the Bible. In fact, she and her dad helped to build reading houses. Folks would actually come and they'd read pamphlets written by George Whitefield and by other preachers who would travel the countryside. So it's into that setting that Patrick Henry was born, the second of 9 children. And he grew up there, rather humble circumstances by most standards, but not a lot of schooling. He maybe attended school 1 year, Patrick Henry, but his dad taught him Latin and Greek and taught him mathematics and ancient history and all. And along about age 9 or so, there was a revivalist coming through town, George Whitefield. I mentioned his name. I like to call him the apostle to 2 continents. He not only reached out to his own peoples there in the home country, but he traveled to the colonies 13 times. Well, 7 trips, 13 crossings. And if you're doing the math, There should be 14 crossings, right? Well, he actually passed away while here in the colonies, and he's buried up to the north, George Whitefield. But when he came through town, Patrick Henry was 9 years old, and his mom said, we're going to those services. Dad was not as inclined. John Henry was the Anglican side. Mom was the real spiritual driving force in Patrick's life. And so he went with his mom, and he stood there transfixed and listened as Whitefield preached. It's said that Whitefield was heard by upwards of 80% of the colonists. More people recognized his name than any other, save the King of England himself. And so that had a transforming effect on Patrick Henry. 2 years later, there was another pastor, Pastor Samuel Davies, who came down from Pennsylvania, settled into Virginia, right there in Hanover County. And Patrick Henry later admitted that that pastor had more of an influence on Patrick Henry's oratorical skills than any other person alive. He just knew how to take a biblical storyline and bring it to life, whether it was the story of the crucifixion or the resurrection. The change of tone, the voice, all of that had a profound effect on Patrick Henry, who himself, as you know, became a great orator. At age 15, Dad determined that Patrick had had enough schooling and set him up in business. He and his brother went into business after he did a short apprenticeship with a shopkeeper, bought some goods, set up shop, and it proceeded to fold in 1 year's time. So Patrick's first effort at business actually fell well short of the mark. He's now 18 years of age. He's out of work. What to do? Get married. And so he did. He married a Sarah, not Sarah Winston in this case, but Sarah Shelton. And they called her Sally, too, by nickname. And the two of them had a wonderful relationship. They got married. In fact, it was Patrick's uncle, who was also a parson in the Anglican Church, who actually married them. And then they were off to a 300-acre plot that was given by the father-in-law, and he tried to eke out an existence raising tobacco for 2 years. It was drought. It was hard times. After 2 years, he ended up residing in Mr. Shelton's tavern. And if you go visit that area of Hanover County, right across the street from the courthouse is Mr. Shelton's tavern. And folks would stay there overnight. Patrick was now living there with his wife and a couple kids already. By the way, he'd eventually have 17 children and 70 grandchildren. I think that Patrick Henry really should be given the title father of this country, not George Washington. What do you think? But while he was at this courthouse, right across from the courthouse, he interfaced with a lot of lawyers, and he talked about the cases that were coming down. His dad was the judge right across the street. And so that probably is where Patrick got his inclination toward the study of law. But not just yet. He decided to go into business yet again, a second time. And by December of that year, he now had 3 children and a wife. He went to a Christmas party, and there he met a 17-year young college student by the name of Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson later was amused, as he wrote, that Patrick Henry seemed so jovial. He seemed so lighthearted, even though his business once again was on the rocks. And that's because Patrick Henry had a different view of things. He believed in a self-reliance that perhaps is not given much emphasis today. In fact, he wrote this in his journal one day that I think tells much of the story, if I can spot where it is, regarding hardship and the challenges that come like that. Basically, and I'm still looking through this spot where it is. It's a powerful statement. Here it is. Adversity toughens manhood. And the characteristic of the good or the great man is not that he's been exempted from the evils of life, but that he has surmounted them. So Patrick was going through some tough times. Business was bad. Things were hard. And it was probably right around that time period, age 23, that he determined to study law. So he got some books, Coke, and some others, and he studied. The record's not all that clear. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a couple months maybe. And then off to Williamsburg. This was his first of several trips to Williamsburg, which was the colonial capital. And as he rode into Williamsburg, his eyes would have shown him all kinds of things. By the way, there's the courthouse. We'll come back to that story in just a little while. That's the Hanover Courthouse. But right now, I'd like to take us on over to Williamsburg. Have any of you been to visit before? Have you been to visit? Okay, many of you have. Good. So you'll recognize the ammunition dump where they kept the ammunition. You'll recognize some of the other stately structures that are still there. I think they were built to last, amen? And so here's one of the churches there as he rode by on his horse. Took him 2 days to ride those 50 miles or so. And then he was not all that inclined toward church activities at the time. Remember, he came from a split background religiously. His mom, very devout. His dad, an Anglican, his dad's brother, a priest in that Anglican church. And here was sort of the heart of the political process, that H-shaped building. We'll have to come back and tell some of the events that transpired there. So as he rode through town, he finally made his way. This is the royal governor's residence. You can, if you zoom in close, you'll recognize the emblem, the symbol of the crown. So this was the king's representative in the colony of Virginia. He got first to the house of George Wythe. And George Wythe was so recognized and influential that when it came time to sign the Declaration of Independence, most signed in August of 1776, which we're celebrating this event here today, aren't we? And the goings on tomorrow. So July 4 is the official day, but actually most signed in August. Just two had signed prior to that time. At any rate, they left a space for George Wythe's name because he was not able to be there in person to sign, and they wanted his to be the first name of the Virginia delegation. So if you look at the Declaration, they're listed by colonies. And there's a blank space because they wanted to make sure there was ample room for him to sign his name. That was the political clout and power that he carried. George Wythe signed off on the license of Patrick Henry, and then it was off to John Peyton's house. Randolph's house, excuse me. Now, Randolph, he was a little taken aback by this Patrick Henry guy. He was dressed in country buckskins, just a little rustic looking. Not so sure if he would work well in the legal system. But after interviewing Patrick Henry, he said this later. If his determination is half equal to his genius, he'll be an ornament to the profession. Later, though, I think Randolph may have regretted signing his name to that license because it was Patrick Henry who locked horns with him on more than one occasion, and eventually Randolph resigned his position and went back to live in England. Little did he know that day when he signed what he was signing on to. And so if you do get inside the residence, you see the beautiful array there that was set up in Williamsburg and all. And I understand that's still on display today. You can go visit those places. So he's now a lawyer. He makes his way back to Hanover County. And for the next 3 years, you don't hear anything from Patrick Henry. The next 4 years, in fact. So what is it that catapulted a 27-year-old lawyer who was just traveling the circuit, taking care of business and all, into colonial and even national fame? It was something called the Parsons Cause, the year 1763. Here's the setup. The tobacco industry was the driving cash crop in Virginia and right up into Maryland here. You do know that Maryland was established as a Catholic colony, but there were soon more Protestants living here than there were Catholics, and so Lord Baltimore's influence lives on in the name of the city, but little else during the time in which we're conversing. At any rate, in this whole Chesapeake region, tobacco was the cash crop. Now, King James probably had it right when he wrote a pamphlet called The Counterblast to Tobacco. He said that tobacco has an obnoxious smell, it's bad for your health. He was ahead of his time medically. He had that one right, but tobacco was the cash crop. And so it was ordinary pastor that the priests and the pastors would be paid in tobacco. That was the cash coin of the day. That's right. Could you imagine taking up offerings, you're dropping tobacco leaves in? That's not quite the way it worked. But each parson would be given a certain amount of pounds of tobacco, and that had monetary value. He could then sell that, and that's how he cared for his family. But these were hard days. I mentioned the drought that Patrick Henry and his family went through. It was so hard, in fact, that the price of tobacco had shot way up. And so to pay the parson in the same poundage would be to have given him a tremendous pay increase while everyone else was hurting. So the House of Burgesses passed a law called the Two-Penny Act. And it said that the parson would be paid 2 pence for each pound of tobacco that they normally would receive. In other words, they need to shoulder the load a little bit too of these hard times. Well, the parsons didn't take too kindly to that, and they sued. And this thing came to court. It ended up in the courthouse right there in Hanover County. And who's the presiding judge? Patrick Henry's dad. And so the defense, those defending this law that had been passed, saying the clergy needs to be willing to pay their share, so to speak, take a little bit less pay. The defense lawyer tried to argue, we've got a law that says this is legal. But the Parsons lawyer argued that the law itself was null and void ab initio. which basically means from its inception, this is a null and void law. So really the question was this: can the House of Burgesses pass a law independent of England that determines how the people would be taxed and how the parsons would be paid? Well, I will tell you that the decision that was made essentially was that no, they can't pass that kind of law. So, and in fact, Patrick Henry's dad agreed. He basically consented to what the argument of the prosecutor was. So all that was left was the assigning of a summary payment. How much should the parsons be paid? At this point, the lawyer for the defense walked out, John Lewis. He was a friend of Patrick Henry's. So Patrick stepped in the very day that they were going to, the next day they were actually going to render a judgment. How much? The jury has to determine how much should the clergy be paid. So it's in that setting that Patrick Henry came in. He said there's a bigger issue at hand here. And his oratorical skills were already of such ability that they said that his dad was seen weeping from the bench as Patrick described how the clergy were just trying to gouge these people. They weren't genuinely interested in their everyday needs. And that this was really a determination: can Virginia regulate itself as a self-governed colony, or is it going to be under the elbow and under the influence of England? And so he said it this way, if we can listen along here.
Instead of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, these rapacious harpies were their powers equal to their will, snatched from the heart of their honest parishioner his last hope. From the widow and her orphan children, their last milk cow.
And with that kind of fiery oratory, the jury dismissed to go make the determination how much should the clergy be paid. And they came back instantly and they announced 1 penny. 1 penny. That's all they're going to get for all their efforts. And instantly, Patrick Henry was a hero. He was put on the shoulders of the farmers. He was carried across the courtyard. There was joy and jubilation, and he now had recognition. That was Patrick Henry's first major breakthrough. Well, 2 years later, we have another event that's going to transpire, not here at Hanover County Courthouse, but it's instead going to be back in Williamsburg. So now it's 1765, and this is going to be his second trip. He had just been elected to the House of Burgesses, and that 2-day trip, once again, he's getting there late. He gets there, in fact, the session's already underway, meeting in this building. Many of you have toured that. You indicated as much. It's an H-shaped building. And inside this area here, of course, William and Mary were the leaders in the 1690s when Virginia really came of age. And so their portraits were hanging inside of the structure. It's not all that big, 10 paces across, 15 paces wide. This is where most of those major arguments that you've probably read of or heard of actually took place. So they were already like 9 days into the session when Patrick shows up. He presents his election papers. Everything's legal. He's now duly seated. And almost instantly, he locks horns with those Tidewater aristocrats. One of those is Peyton Randolph. Remember the guy, John Randolph, who had signed off on his licensure? Well, here's another relative who serves as a speaker and as a treasurer, which Patrick Henry had a real problem with that. A conflict of interest. Why should the speaker also be the one that handles the money? And because he was willing to challenge these well-established Eastern bureaucrats, as it were, it really gave encouragement to the other representatives from the western portions of Virginia. Now they had a voice. They had someone to speak up on their behalf. So here, the Speaker of the House, also serving as treasurer. By the way, 3 days into his first session, Patrick Henry introduced a piece of legislation to separate those two offices. So this is the kind of guy he was. He just had that ability to sniff out corruption and conflict of interest and all. And so he was willing to take them on. And they're asking, who is this guy, Patrick Henry? In fact, they went back and looked at his election papers. Is he legal? Can we throw him out? Does that sound at all familiar? Some things don't change in time. But that was Patrick Henry's first introduction there to the political realm there. And already he'd established a voice for those folks off to the west. Before I roll this next segment, let me just set this up a little bit further. It's 1765, and there's a Stamp Act that had been passed by England. And the Stamp Act essentially said anything written on paper, whether it's a last will and testament, a marriage license, you name it, anything written on paper had to have a king's stamp. Now you had to pay a tax for all of these things. And the issue was not how much, it was whether or not a foreign entity had the power to put a tax on people without their having representation. Now let me see if I can clear the air, because there are some who misinterpret this and misunderstand. Patrick Henry was not advocating for representatives to go to Whitehall, to go to London and represent the colonies. Instead, he introduced 6 resolves, 6 resolutions that essentially said when the Virginia colony was established, those folks have the same rights of any British subject, right? And then as any British citizen, as it were. Then secondly, he argued that the House of Representatives for their Congress of colony, the House of Burgesses, was the official voice of the people. They were the elected representatives. And it is that entity that should determine the taxation, not some foreign entity. Patrick Henry was not arguing that we should send representatives to England. Some would say, if we sent reps, then we would have representatives and then we could have taxation. He said it this way. He said that the Parliament of England has no more right to lay taxes on Virginia than does the Parliament of Spain. See, we're members of the British Empire, but we're not under Parliament. Our contract is with the king. The king is now betraying the cause because he's letting Parliament, to whom we have no voice, we have no representatives there on our behalf, and if we let this slide, and by the way, here in 1765, most were saying, well, I think it was Ben Franklin who said, how do you stop the rain? How do you stop the rain? It's just coming. But Patrick Henry said, no, we've got to stand here. If we don't stand here, we won't stand anywhere. And so his argument is that we pass these strong set of resolves that rebukes Parliament for trying to put a tax on the colonies. And when he spoke, he had that power, that eloquence that just captured the crowd and angered many of those bureaucrats to the east. So listen along. Let's see if you can hear what he has to say as he's saying, we've got to stop this Stamp Act before it takes over us.
Had his boots. Charles I, his brother. And George III, treason. They profit from their example. If this be treason, make the most of it.
Wow, those were incendiary words. That was 1765. So the die is cast, and we call this man the trumpet voice of liberty because he's now speaking out where others had really little courage to do so. Massachusetts, let's give them credit. They were taking a stance, but most of the other colonies, they were willing to concede. Most of the folks in Virginia, they wanted to pass a Jamaican resolution that would basically kind of scold Parliament and say, no, but submit to it. He said, we've got to take a stand here or we'll take a stand nowhere. So things are really beginning to develop. And when he was accused of treason here, he turned and said, make the most of it. Powerful words indeed. Well, Patrick Henry always had a shrewd sense of the future and where things lay. He saw an opportunity to purchase some land a little bit further west of where he had been born and brought up. But this time he had a growing brood of kids. And so off to Scotchtown they went. And it's worth your time. If you have a chance to get down into this western part of Virginia and visit Scotchtown, still beautifully manicured and kept up. It's a big, simple structure. Now, he was actually earning a fair bit of money by now because his reputation had preceded him. Oh, before I go further on this, I should probably tell you, he also became a great friend of the Baptist preachers in the day. See, the Baptists were still facing persecution. I mean, imprisonment in Virginia because they were not following the official Anglican way. And so there was one occasion where Patrick rode 50 miles out of his way so that he could be there to defend some pastors who had already been in prison. And he arrived at the courthouse just as they were reading the declaration. And he said, can you read that indictment again? Are you saying that these men are being imprisoned for what? Preaching the gospel of Christ? And he said it in such a way that the prosecutors withdrew their case and the pastors returned free. So he was a true friend of the dissidents, those that did not follow the official Anglican way. Like I say, his mom's side really had quite an influence on him. The Presbyterians, now the Baptists coming into Virginia. So he became recognized as a person who would speak out on behalf of those that would not follow the doctrinaire ways of the Anglican Church. So he was earning a fair bit of income, but he was a rather humble kind of a guy. So he has this house now. It looks like a single-story structure. It's actually 3 levels high. Hip roof there. At the top level is this open area, 90 feet long, 30 feet wide. And with his growing family, it made a great play place on rainy days. And he'd also gather his family. Patrick Henry was a musical kind of a person. He loved to play the violin. When he was growing up, he was quite skilled until he broke his shoulder. When he broke his shoulder, he had to switch over to the flute for a while. But here he would gather his family, gather other groups, and they'd have musical get-togethers and that kind of thing. Still not a lot of spiritual interest, personally. That will come. But at this point, he still has not made that connection. But he is defending the Baptist preachers. He's standing on their behalf there, for which he's greatly, greatly appreciated. So this is Scotchtown, and here his family will grow in size. Also, his wife begins to show some challenges, some mental instability, and things are going to deteriorate over time. But he faithfully stood by her side, even to the point where she had to be confined to a room for her own health's sake. He was there to bring food and to care for her. He stayed by her side to the very end. In fact, when he made that famous speech there in 1775 that I started with, his wife had died that week. You think about that. The week that he was catapulted to the national level as never thought of before, he'd buried his wife that very week. That's the kind of personal challenges he went through, but he persevered. So rather simple affair by today's standard, not a palatial place at all, but well worth your time touring if and when you have time and opportunity. But we must accelerate. We're celebrating July 4. What are the proximate causes? What's the exact issue? Well, in 1765, the Stamp Act was repealed, but they came back through with another set of acts under Townsend, and they were going to tax sugar, and they were going to tax tea, and those kinds of things. And once again, Patrick Henry stood up, he spoke out. He said, we need to arm a militia. We need to have ammunition and gunpowder to protect ourselves. Because if the king does not follow with his contract, he has basically aborted the whole process. Well, that did not go over well with the rural governor. And so more than once, when Patrick Henry stood up to speak in the House of Burgesses, the rural governor would simply dismiss the House of Burgesses. He would just cancel their meeting. So they would repair to this nearby Raleigh's Inn. So a lot of the political goings-on, you may know this already, actually transpired inside this structure. One day, for example, when there were challenges up in Boston, the Tea Party, 1773, and the British announced that they were going to be putting an embargo, Patrick Henry called for a day of fasting and prayer right there in Virginia, and promptly the royal governor canceled their meeting. So they repaired to the Raleigh Inn. This is where they had a lot of their discussions. This is where Patrick Henry was actually then voted to be sent for the first time out of his home colony to represent that colony. Actually, his second trip. His first one was to New York, but now he's going to Philadelphia to basically say, what can we do about this growing impasse? No one at this point was saying we have to rebel and run away from that. All we want are the rights that we've always enjoyed. We want to repair the situation. We want to rectify it. In fact, the Olive Branch Petition shows that the colonists were reaching out to the British. If you'll simply abide by the guidelines that were well in place for all of these years, centuries in fact, then we'll be in good shape. So this idea that everyone just wanted to take up a gun and rebel because, after all, we don't like the government, so we overthrow it, that was not the mindset or spirit at all. They were being forced into a place here. So Patrick Henry off to Philadelphia goes, and en route he swings by Mount Vernon, and he rides with Washington. So he and George Washington got to know each other pretty well on that trip. And he came back from there. That was 1774. Things are really beginning to pick up momentum here, and I see we have to pick up our momentum here too with time and all. And so that sets us up for the now famous speech at the old St. John's Church. That was March of 1775. 1 month later, gunshots at Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world. He had predicted it. He said, we already hear the chains rattling to the north. And when he ended that speech, remember, I was right outside the window. I could almost reach out and touch his clothes. He said, give me liberty. And he raised that right hand with such drama. And he paused dramatically, or give me death. And he plunges this dagger into his own heart. I'd rather die than not be a free man. That was Patrick Henry. So the St. John Church speech was, which he had not written. He just spoke that extemporaneously. But it was written down and it quickly gained circulation. And if you have a chance to visit Richmond, you definitely want to drop by the church. A beautiful location, and get a sense of where all of that history began. I mentioned that the aisle was narrow and crowded. Folks were packed in on both sides. And I literally stood outside the window right there and listened to that now famous speech. That was March of 1775. We need to hasten on. The Declaration itself comes in July of 1776. I got the Declaration of Independence. You thought it was in the National Archives. Here it is. And no, they can't have it back. No, actually, this is a copy. What's interesting, though, is on July 2, when the resolution was actually forwarded, the first thing they did was to have a time of prayer that lasted almost 4 hours. Not bad for a bunch of deists. That's what some of the historians already are trying to say, that the Founding Fathers were not Christians. In fact, there's a book that came out called The Godless Constitution. The Founding Fathers were a bunch of deists. Not bad, though, for a bunch of deists to have a 4-hour prayer session. Contrast that with the French Revolution. Did they have a prayer session on July 14, 1789? I assure you they did not. As they stormed the Bastille, the bloodletting. Can I put this in parenthetically? What was it that brought that French Revolution? The proximate cause was food shortage. There were two groups that controlled the food coming into Paris, and they shut down the food supply, and there were riots in the street. Can we learn from history? I ask you. So the Declaration is signed there. In fact, here's the prayer service that I made reference to. And then it came time to sign. Of course, you've got some of those luminaries on the dais there. If you look carefully, it almost appears that Jefferson is standing on the foot of Adams. I'm not sure what the significance of that is, but I'll draw to your attention one other individual that's there. Do you see him? Of the 56 signers, he's the only one wearing a hat. His name is Stephen Hopkins. He's the governor of Rhode Island. And when he signed the Declaration, remember most signed on August 2. Let's get a close-up. By the way, you see that gap. See, they left a gap right there because they wanted to have space for George Wythe to sign. But look at Stephen Hopkins' signature. It's almost illegible. It's almost illegible because he suffered from something called, we would probably call it Parkinson's disease today. But his hand quivered. So much so that when he took the quill in hand, they said that he literally had to hold his wrist with his other hand as he signed his signature. And he said this, "My hand may tremble, but my heart does not." That was the caliber of individual signing this document, risking their honor, their wealth, their very lives. And there's a whole nother presentation on the worthy company that signed that document here. But in short order, in fact, I'll show you this quotation. Samuel Adams said it quite succinctly when he observed, "We have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and from the rising to the setting of the sun, let his kingdom come." That was the spiritual heartbeat that started this nation. Don't believe otherwise. So what's the story about George Washington? Well, before he crossed the Delaware, Christmas Eve, 1776, it looked like actually this experiment in liberty was going to be snuffed out in August. The Battle of Brooklyn Heights. The clock tells me I cannot go into much detail on this, but the Liberty Bells rang out and people were celebrating. There was jubilation in the streets, and then it looked like the little candle was going to be snuffed out. It's now late August of 1776. Washington had been selected as the commander-in-chief of this ragtag army by the Second Continental Congress, of which Patrick Henry was a part. And he had this group there. They were basically cornered in Brooklyn, and the British were moved in. They already controlled the East River. The only way out was across the East River, but there was no way of escape because the British controlled the waters. And you know how sound travels on water on a hot, humid day. Well, the battle actually never came to fruition that afternoon as anticipated. So Washington, with about 8,000 regulars, he had just gotten a group of recruits in from Connecticut, and they were used to rowing their boats. They call it rowing without washing the oars. That's where you can row very quietly and not make noise. And basically all of Washington's men said, we have no choice but to just basically dig in and die because there's no escape. except for Washington, who said, can't we effect an escape across the East River? How? The British control the waters. They have Marines there. How much does sound travel on water, right? Well, can we do it by night? Well, that's not going to help much because there's still the noise. The British will discover what's going on. And the worst place to be is in a position of retreat when you're attacked. He said, let's do it anyway. How about it? So as they were preparing for this strategic retreat, a storm blew up. Wouldn't you know it? How about that? A storm blew up such that it was so loud and noisy with all of the wind and the rain, the British had no idea what was happening. So through the night, stealthily, those soldiers are being extricated over to Manhattan. And the guys rowing the oars, they're doing a good job. And then the storm abated around midnight. Now it's quiet, hot, it's humid. But they quietly continued to go. About 2:30 or so in the morning, Washington, supervising the whole operation, asked a certain detachment where they were from. Oh, we're part of the Pennsylvania Company. Pennsylvania, you're supposed to be in the front lines. For half an hour, there was no one on the front lines. So if the British sentries had been watching, they would have detected there's no one there. But by the grace of God, the one man who knew that that was the problem got them back in their places. Now, the sun's going to be coming up shortly, and they're still transitioning. There's no way they can get them all out. And at that point, every person who kept a journal recorded in their journal for that day that a fog arose off of the river, a fog so thick you could not see a man 6 paces. And they continued to escape. How about that? Through the morning hours. And then the fog began to burn off with the morning sun. Washington was on the last boat across. The British saw what was happening. They ran down to the shoreline, fired a futile volley. Washington lived to fight another day. That was August of 1776. The experiment was almost snuffed out, like taking your fingers and taking out the candle, taking out the flame. 1 year later, 1777, you have the Battle of Saratoga. Boy, that's another incredible event. Pastor, can we stop the clock? We have too much to tell here. I'll finish this part out. Okay. Have you had a chance to visit the Saratoga battle site? You need to. Down on McLean's farm, there is a little wrought iron apparatus. You follow a blacktop path down through the shrubs and all, and inside is a statue to a boot. And you wonder, what would a statue of a boot be doing at the battle? You probably know from your general studies, and even from what your parents have told you here, that the Battle of Saratoga was the turning point of the war. That was where things began to go in the colonist direction. The French agreed to sign on, and things began to slowly, inexorably come our way. We weren't out of the woods yet, but if we'd lost this battle, it would have been curtains, very likely, because they were going to divide the colonies, take care of New England first, and then come down to Maryland and Virginia and take care of this area too. So there was one guy, a general actually, who had been grousing how poorly Congress had been taking care of them, the Continental Congress. And what he said was right, but his attitude was not. So he was furloughed. There's a sport, I understand, that has developed here called ice hockey. And if someone violates certain rules, they have to be put into a penalty box. Okay, this general was in the penalty box. He was not allowed to participate. He was not allowed to be involved in any way. And he watched as the battle began to unfold. And the colonists were taking it on the chin. They were in a bad way, so he violated his probation rules. He jumped on his horse, rode into the fray, got things corrected, helped to turn the battle toward the colonists' cause. In the process, he was shot right through the boot with a mini ball. So this statue is put in place to honor that man and his effort that literally saved the country's future. His name? Benedict Arnold. How about that? So if you visit the battle site today, there's an obelisk with 4 niches, and the one is empty because that man betrayed his country. And in fact, it was Benedict Arnold that came through Richmond and drove Patrick Henry out when he was serving as governor. It was Benedict Arnold that harassed the folks in and around the Maryland area. So he had turned on his own country, helped to save the cause in 1777, but because of a wife's appetite for the rich things, he betrayed the cause. Sad story. Believe it or not, Patrick Henry was not there for the Declaration of Independence. He was one step ahead. He was already helping to write the Constitution for Virginia. He was elected as the first governor of Virginia. He would serve in that position several times over. He and Jefferson switched out those positions back and forth for a number of years running. So always ahead of the game, Patrick Henry was. Well, the War for Independence finally does come to a conclusion, and the Lord was pleased to allow this new nation to be birthed. And contrary to some of the storylines that you're reading today, it was founded very squarely on biblical principles. Was every man a Christian? No. And we're not trying to say that everyone was. but the Bible was paramount. It was at the centerpiece of the whole operation here. The story's not quite over. We have just enough time to share this addendum because every one of us today is indebted to the work of Patrick Henry for the freedoms we enjoy right now. Why did Patrick oppose the Constitution? In his words, he smelled a rat. He knew that the articles needed addressing, but this new document, he felt, gave too much power to the centralized government. And he made some predictions that were rather interesting. Of course, they had to ratify in 9 states, and Virginia, coming into the ratification convention to which he was elected as a representative, Madison predicted that we've got 50 more votes on our side than the opposition does. But every day Patrick Henry spoke, some of those switched sides. He had that ability. He spoke probably out of the 20 or so day convention, he spoke on all but 3 or 4 days. If you read the transcripts of those hearings, he has about a third of all of what's written. One day he spoke for 7 hours. One day he spoke 8 times. And there were people that came from far and near just to listen to him speak. There was one guy in the balcony, and he looked at his hands to see if there were handcuffs on it. The description was so vivid. Another was so caught up in the commentary, he just involuntarily spit his tobacco juice over the balcony. Someone below got nailed.
I know it's covered before you. It has an awful swing. Big swing towards monarchy. This country may become a king.
Never.
To be supported is extravagant magnificence by 2 sets of tax collectors.
Yeah.
He will have a standing army at his command, and a long and rapacious trade of officers and dependents. The Congress may regulate elections to their own advantage, increase their own pay without limitation, and they are given power by the sweeping clause that permits them to pass any law which they deem necessary and proper. But where is your bill of rights? There is none.
Powerful statement. And they say that a mere wag of his head or a nod of his head in another direction would cause votes to switch sides. When the vote actually came down, it was a 10-vote margin in favor. So he'd gone from 50 down to 10. Now, he later said that he would voluntarily submit to the Constitution. He just issued these concerns. And the Bill of Rights basically was promised by Madison and others on the work of this man, Patrick Henry. We have to accelerate toward the end of his life. This is when he really began to get tuned in spiritually. In fact, he wrote a tract. And in that, he basically, when he made his rounds, he was still doing the lawyering business. He would hand these tracts out, and he laughingly would tell the judges that they may think he had become a monk. But he really sensed the spiritual side much more late in life. In fact, he confessed that he wished he had been more spiritually attuned early in life. But this time he moves from Scotchtown to Red Hill. His first wife having died, he remarried, had more children, a total of 17. I told you about that. And this is where he spent his last years. A blacksmithy there. You can still visit this location too. This is the room in which he breathed out his last. You see the baby cradle. His youngest was just 3 years old when he passed away. This is the little law office where many an apprentice came to work under Patrick Henry, and he really had a guiding, a shaping influence on their lives. Well, a few quotations before we go to that final scene here, and they're rather self-explanatory. You can listen along. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging the future, but by the past. Patrick Henry also made this observation: liberty, the greatest of all earthly blessings. Give us that precious jewel, and you can take everything else. This is a powerful statement that he observed. Bad men cannot make good citizens. It is impossible that a nation of infidels or idolaters should be a nation of free men. It is when people forget God that tyrants forge their chains. A vitiated state of morals, a corrupted public conscience is incompatible with freedom. And 1 or 2 more for good measure here. Amongst other strange things said of me, I hear it said by the deists that I am one of their number. This thought gives me much more pain than the appellation of Tory. In other words, I would rather be called a Tory than the fact that I am supposedly a deist. I find much cause to reproach myself that I have lived so long and have given no decided and public proofs of my being a Christian. But indeed, my dear child, he's writing to his daughter, this is the character which I prize far above all this world has or can boast. And then I think one more here. The Bible is worth all other books which have ever been printed, and it's been my misfortune that I have never found time to read it with the proper attention and feeling till lately. I trust in the mercy of heaven that it is not yet too late. So this is the chair where Patrick Henry sat when the doctor gave him that medication. He was suffering from an intestinal illness, and either this mercury would help break through or it would take his life. And Patrick Henry knew that this, as he partook, this may well be his family gathered, they were crying, and he had this to say, as it's been reenacted here. Let's see if we can get this to roll.
Take my soul, save my family, my brother, and my friends. Amen. Friends, we have had many arguments respecting the Christian religion. Observe now how great the benefit and reality of religion is to the man about to die.
His daughter later wrote, he met death with firmness and in full confidence that through the merits of a bleeding Savior, his sins would be pardoned. How about that? What a testimony. And if I could leave you with one last statement from Patrick Henry, it would be this. Later, amongst his materials and will, an envelope was sealed with wax was found. And inside was a draft of the Stamp Act resolves. On the back, Patrick Henry had written a brief account of what had transpired. And then he wrote this. Whether this will prove a blessing or curse will depend upon the use our people make of the blessings which a gracious God hath bestowed on us. Righteousness alone can exalt them as a nation. Reader, wherever thou art, remember this, and in thy sphere practice virtue thyself and encourage it in others. Thank you. Pastor.